Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. Today I'm going to ask a fairly simple question that has a fairly complicated answer. And the question is, why don't people rob banks anymore? That is to say, in your comics, and I've heard this question a number of places in comic book circles over the last years, why don't you just have a simple story where you have a superhero and they're stopping a supervillain who's robbing a bank? Why can't you have a story like that anymore? And it feeds into the larger question of what makes a supervillain, what makes a villain. And, I went over that a little bit in my series about heroes, and I want to talk about that probably in more than just this video about what makes a villain. But I want to concentrate on that question. Why don't you have supervillains just robbing banks anymore? Now, again, I'm going to go deep into this, and I want to go back, and I think it has something to do with power fantasies, because to some extent comics are a power fantasy. And to explain power fantasy and what I mean sort of literary, in the literary genre, how it works, I need to go into something that I really don't like to talk about because I really don't like it, but and I'll probably get some flack for it, but it's Harry Potter. And Harry Potter is a power fantasy. And I think J.K. Rowling is a bad writer because she just uses tropes in order to draw in people and makes them identify with her character, and therefore that's how she gains her audience, by actually appealing to their baser nature. But it's because of power fantasy, because Harry Potter is a pathetic character. That is to say, he has pathetic traits. He has all of these traits which you would consider pathetic, and she just rams as many of them in there as possible. He's an orphan, and his people who take care of him are mean to him, make him sleep under the stairs. They have money, but they won't let him have any. Therefore, he's poor technically. He's not good at any kind of sports. He's weak. He has people in his family, like his cousin, just bully him. He's a bookworm. He wears glasses. All of these things. And why I say, and they're all tropes, and this is a lazy way of writing, if you ask me, because all she's doing is she's pushing as many pathetic qualities into this character as possible, so that everyone who reads it, because everybody has some kind of pathetic quality in themselves, can just identify with that pathetic quality in themselves with this character, and then all of a sudden this character is given this power, and so the person who identifies with them, the reader, is using him as a surrogate person where they get power, because you have Harry and he has his letter, and all of a sudden he is famous, and everybody wants to know him. He's popular. He's suddenly rich. He has parents which are really nice even though they're dead. He has power because he has magic which no one else has, and he's good at sports because all of a sudden he's good at Quidditch and all these other kinds of things. And the thing is that the power fantasy basically turns into a revenge fantasy, and that's where I think that it is appealing to people's baser nature, because it's taking these pathetic qualities that everybody has and is not taking your character and elevating them above these pathetic qualities. It's actually reveling in those pathetic qualities and saying, nah, I have these powers now. Look, I'm getting revenge on the world because I am powerful. Now, you can disagree with me on that. That's fine. I'm not one to actually argue that entire thing because I'm not an expert in Harry Potter, nor do I wish to be. But when I realized that about Harry Potter, I started to think to myself, well, that kind of sounds like a lot of my comic books growing up. Are they just the same? And the more I thought about it, I thought, no, they're not the same, because there's a distinct difference in the fact that they are superheroes. Because look, if you have people like Peter Parker, he's a weak kid, he's bullied, he wears these big old glasses, right? And he is like rail thin, and all of a sudden he gains this power. You even have Steve Rogers, he's the beanpole. He goes back to the 1940s version of being bullied, and he's 4F and all these other things. You have the X-Men, who are outcasts, and not just outcasts, but to some extent freaks, and all of a sudden they gain power. All these people gain power. Isn't that a power fantasy? Yeah, it's a power fantasy, because that's where the superpowers come in. It's a power fantasy, but it's not a revenge fantasy, because they don't revel in those pathetic qualities, which we all have. Because what happens is, and I would say this has to do with how comic books developed, because they weren't always about superheroes. There were plenty of times where the actual genre was more about other kinds of comics than superhero comics. You had a lot of just plain old heroes. You got your war comics, you got your Western comics. There were plenty of heroes. They didn't have superpowers. So the genre, to some extent, is about heroes more than it is about powers. And when you have a superhero, yes, the super part has this power fantasy element to it, but the hero part, traditionally in your older comic books, it outshines the idea of the power, because let's take Peter Parker as our example. He's probably the easiest and greatest example. You have this pathetic kid who automatically just gains power, and all of a sudden he tries to use it for his own self-gain. He realizes that that's not going to do him any good, that with great power comes great responsibility, and that he's going to have to elevate himself beyond his poorer qualities, his baser nature, and be better and actually serve people with these powers. And so he becomes a superhero. And that's what makes him a superhero. He realizes that he needs to use these powers for a greater purpose. And that's not something certainly that came about by having Peter Parker and Spider-Man. That's an idea that has run straight through Western civilization for the last 2,000 years. It's that the more power you have, the more responsibility you have to use that power for others, because technically if you have more power than other people, it's not your power, it belongs to everyone, and you need to serve other people with it. It's an idea that's been around for the last 2,000 years. So that's the idea of hero. And as I'm always saying, as I said in my hero videos, the traditional idea of hero is that this person is a paragon of virtue. In order to live in a way that you take the power that you've been given and take great responsibility for it by serving others with it, that encapsulates the idea of virtue. And it's the old idea of virtue, and that idea has encapsulated in it an idea of good and evil, objective good and evil. It's good and evil for everyone, everywhere. And so that's how you build your hero. So how does this tie into my question, why don't people rob banks anymore? Well, because if you look at it, Dr. Octopus is the exact same character as Peter Parker, because he's this guy. He's an older guy. He's not a young kid. He's an older guy, but he is fairly well out of shape, just like Peter. He wears these big old Coke glass bottle glasses, kind of just like Peter, and he's all of a sudden given this power. All of a sudden he got this power thrust upon him, but he doesn't use the power to actually serve others. He doesn't overcome his baser nature. He rebels in his baser nature, and he says, well, I got these powers, I'm going to use them for my own self. And so the way that traditionally you show that they're a supervillain is, of course, they go rob a bank. Why do they go rob a bank? Well, because you have a very good representation, an easy representation of everybody's work is with money, right? That's what your money is. It's a representation of the work that you have done, and you have it all in this big building, so you have this representation of everybody's work, which is due to them justly, and it's in this giant building. And so this person, because they have power, they're using this power to unjustly take this away from the other people. So they rob a bank, and it's an easy way to show you that this is a supervillain. So again, there's very little difference in you're looking at the characters of Peter Parker and Dr. Octopus at their origin. Okay, they're very similar. It's just the choices that they make how to use the power that either makes them a hero or makes them a villain. And that's the thing. Again, SJWs can't use the traditional idea of hero, because the traditional idea of hero has within it the idea of virtue. The idea of virtue traditionally has within it the ideas of objective right and wrong, good and evil. And of course, your SJWs and your communist socialist minded people, who SJWs are, they reject all ideas of objective good and evil. And they say, well, it's just the good for me and what's good for you, which is subjective ideas of good, right? And they think that all quote unquote evil, which they would probably put down as, marginalization or persecution or these kinds of words they would use, all come from institutions, right? They all come from bigger institutions, like capitalism. It is the great oppressor, right? So here's why you don't have actual villains robbing banks anymore, is because in an SJW mind, of course, if you're somebody who's automatically given power, you don't need to use it for other people. You don't have to actually use it to serve others. Why would you do that? Because, of course, they don't have any objective norms of good and evil in their mind. Therefore, they don't believe that there's anything or any reason why you should actually use it for other people. You could just use it for your own selfish ends, of course. Now, if you can use it for your own selfish ends, well, you might as well just go ahead and do that. And in their minds, they would use that power, if they had the power, to redress the balance of this great oppressor of these institutions, and would take these institutions down a peg. And since capitalism is one of these institutions, of course, and banks are just a big old arm of this institution of capitalism, if you have a person who gains superpowers and they can do whatever they want with it, they should, if they're going to actually do something that's quote unquote good in an SJW's mind, actually robbing a bank would be a good thing, because they're sticking it to the man. They're actually trying to destroy capitalism. And so robbing a bank in their minds would actually be a good thing. You see how twisted it gets when you get into the mind of an SJW? Anyways, so the thing is that for these characters, of course, since they don't have these objective ideas of what a hero is and what a villain is, in their mind, these people, they can't do things that traditionally a villain would do, because, again, if you're automatically just given superpowers, why not use them for your own self-gain? I mean, it's your good, right? So you might as well use them for that. So just go ahead and do so. And this is why you get these overly convoluted storylines in comics now, is because they have no actual reference to good and evil, objective good and evil. And therefore, since they have no really easy way to show you that, look, this is a hero and this is a villain, you have good versus evil, they have to have this convoluted storyline in order to draw you in with sort of the idea of this is fascinating rather than this is good versus evil. And so when you actually look at it, some of these villains could be heroes and some of these heroes could be villains, because again, in an SJW's mind, there's really no difference between the two. There's just different perspectives, right? If you look at Dr. Octopus robbing a bank as an SJW perspective, he's actually doing a good thing, right? He's actually doing something that would make him a hero in the eyes of an SJW. So since they don't have any reference to these greater objective ideas, they just have to construct a story that is so convoluted that you just actually don't notice that. And they're trying to draw you in through storytelling which is intriguing, rather than being storytelling which I would say elevates you above the ideas of a baser, selfish nature into the ideas of a hero. And again, if you look at things like the MCU's latest Avengers movie, people are saying, you look at Thanos and is he a villain? Is he actually a villain? Oh, look, he destroyed the population of half of the population of the entire universe. Yes, he's a villain. But in the mind of the SJWs, well, he has a point. He has a perspective. Maybe his perspective is good. And, everybody just has their own perspective. Therefore, he really doesn't look like a villain to the SJWs. And maybe he isn't a villain to them. And so that's why, again, I would say from the late 90s up until the present, you have these overly complicated stories. Because, of course, most of these people, and I would say, SJWs have been in comics for a long time, since the early to mid 90s, they make these complicated stories because they have no reference to these greater ideas of good and evil. Therefore, they got to mix up the ideas of a superhero and a supervillain. And I would say more than that, they present these stories in order to present to you, to stick under your nose, the idea within this story that there's no actual ideas of good and evil. Good and evil don't actually exist. There's just different perspectives. And therefore, in giving you this overly complicated story where you can see the villain's perspective, and he might be right, and you can see the hero's perspective, and they might be wrong. There's actually saying to you, you know what, there's no actual thing of good and evil. It's just in the older stories, I'd say from the mid-90s until the mid-2000s and a little after that, they sort of took this idea and they put it underneath so that they hid it in the stories that you didn't quite get it. It wasn't there in sticking in your face. But now when you have the SJWs, they just slap it right on top. They don't care. They just put the thing right on top of the story and they say, yep, nope, there's no ideas of good and evil. That's ridiculous. You just have different perspectives. And everybody is starting to wake up and see that, yeah, that's not what I want in my comic books. You know, I want a superhero. I want a supervillain. I want supervillains to do things like rob banks and just give me a good old story. But you don't get that anymore because, of course, you just have superpowered individuals. You don't have superheroes. And this, I think, is why, to some extent, that SJWs think that comic books are for them. Because if there's no actual idea of a superhero anymore, there's just superpowered individuals, then that power fantasy just becomes a revenge fantasy. And to them, all their lives are just about revenge fantasy. They want power in order to get revenge on basically reality, or you know, your country, or whatever society that you live in. They just want power to actually gain revenge on these things, either institutions or countries or reality itself. And so it's a power fantasy that becomes a revenge fantasy. And they think that comics were always this way because, of course, in their mind, there was never any ideas of good and evil, and therefore it's always been about revenge fantasies. So why not just put it on top, stick it right in the people's faces that it's just a revenge fantasy. That's all it is. And to their minds, that's perfectly okay. That's what they think that life is actually supposed to be like. Anyways, I actually have a lot more to say in this topic. I wanted to go deeper into this topic, and there are some places here where I'm sure you see a couple of holes, and hopefully in a couple of other videos, or at least one more video, talk about this and the ideas of why SJWs do this to our comics, and why villains are no longer villains and heroes are no longer heroes. Anyways, hopefully I've given you something new to think about. If I did, hit like, hit subscribe, and leave a comment for me so that you give me something new to think about. That would be great. All right, I'll see you later. Bye.